This is lesson 11.2, the Black Death. You'll notice that this lesson is quite a bit longer than the last one. That last one was quite short. This is about a medium-sized one. And so the question is, how did the plague reshape European society? Place, still Europe. Time frame, about 1347 to 1351. Key people of the Black Death, the Flagellants. There were other people also, but I'll pick this one out in particular. Key concepts of the Black Death, the dance macabre, and pogroms. What are pogroms? So imagine that in the time it takes to complete high school, half of all the people you know die of disease. It makes COVID-19 look lame by comparison. The term Black Death actually did not arrive until sometime after the event. At the time, it was actually called the Great Mortality, and it lasted from 1347 to 1351. However, the plague traveled around Europe for centuries after 1351. The culprits: bacteria, fleas, and rats. The famine of 1315 to 1322, we talked about this last time. By 1300, Europeans were farming almost all the land that they could cultivate. A population crisis developed. Climate changes in Europe produced 7 years of crop failures between 1315 and 1322 because of excessive rain. As many as 15% of the peasants died in some villages. And one consequence of starvation and poverty was susceptibility to disease. The path of the plague. Here's a map of Europe. And as you can see, the plague started in the south and gradually traveled northward over a period of about 4 years. In the spring of 1347, the plague reached the city of Constantinople from Asia. The symptoms: buboes can form, and septicemia forms, and there's almost a 100% mortality rate. The Black Death came actually in 3 forms. You had the bubonic plague, the pneumonic plague, and the septicemic plague. Let's start with the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague was the most commonly seen form of the Black Death. The mortality rate was 30 to 75%. The symptoms were enlarged and inflamed lymph nodes around the armpits, neck, and groin. Victims were subject to headaches, nausea, aching joints, fever of 101 to 105 degrees, vomiting, and a general feeling of illness. Symptoms took 1 to 7 days to appear. Then you have the pneumonic plague. The pneumonic plague was the second most commonly seen form of the Black Death. The mortality rate for the pneumonic plague was 90 to 95%. If treated today, the mortality rate would be 5 to 10%. The pneumonic plague infected the lungs. Symptoms included slimy sputum tinted with blood, and sputum is saliva mixed with mucus exerted from the respiratory system. The disease would destroy your lungs, and you died by asphyxiation. As the disease progressed, the sputum became free-flowing and bright red. Symptoms also took 1 to 7 days to appear. In other words, with the bubonic plague and the pneumonic plague, you could tell someone had it just by looking at them. But the septicemic plague was different. The septicemic plague was the most rare form of all, but the mortality rate was close to 100%. Even today, there is no treatment. Symptoms were a high fever and skin turning deep shades of purple, and the Black Death got its name from the deep purple, almost black discoloration. Victims usually died the same day symptoms appeared. In some cities, as many as 800 people died every day. So with the septicemic plague, you couldn't see it coming. Symptoms didn't appear until the person was almost dead of it. The effects of the Black Death on Europe. 1/3 of the population of Europe died at a minimum. That 1/3 statistic has been used so much and for so long that no one remembers where it came from. More recent studies show that the death rate may have been much higher. In all, at least 25 million people in Europe died from the plague. Entire communities completely disappeared by the thousands. The effect on children. Children suffered as well, and a common nursery rhyme is, ring around the Rosie. Pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. So ring around the Rosie means rosary beads that give you God's help. A pocket full of posies was used to stop the odor of rotten bodies, which was at one point thought to cause the plague. Keep in mind, there was no germ theory at this time. And posies were also used widely by plague doctors to protect them from infected plague victims. Ashes, ashes. The church actually burned the dead when burying them became too laborious. We all fall down means we're all dead. The disease cycle. It worked like this. The flea drinks rat blood that carries the bacteria. The bacteria multiply in the flea's gut. The flea's gut gets clogged with bacteria, and then the flea bites the human and regurgitates blood into the human wound, and the human is infected. This is a picture from the Toggenburg Bible of 1411. This is a picture of a doctor lancing a bubo. The Black Plague brought about an obsession with death in art and literature. The author Giovanni Boccaccio, in his famous book The Decameron, said the victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors. The dance macabre. This was an artistic genre that commented on the universality of death, because no matter what your station in life, you are vulnerable to death, whether you're a serf at the very bottom of society or a king at the very top. Attempts to stop the plague. You had the doctor's robe, and you also had leeching. Bloodletting. Bloodletting was thought to rid the blood of poisons and bring the fluids into balance. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the scientific revolution. The plague doctor. The iconic plague doctor did not actually appear until later in the plague's history, but they're still fun to talk about. And their greatest contribution was not healing people, but collecting vital statistics and info about the plague, because they weren't actual doctors, but they were actually paid more than real doctors, because their job was actually quite dangerous, and many of them died. The Flagellante. These were people who did self-inflicted penance for everyone's sins. These people would wear uniforms, and they would assemble in the square of a town and whip themselves bloody with spiked whips. Their aim was to rid an area of sin by doing this, and they were often highly disruptive and unruly. The church did not like the flagellants at all. In fact, many of these flagellants claimed to have spiritual healing and spiritual authority. They often attacked people who they thought were not living a devout life, and often their victims were the local priests. Pogroms against the Jews. And you've got some pictures of some of the things that Jews had to wear in the Middle Ages in order to identify themselves. For example, a special hat and an obligatory badge called a golden circle. Sound familiar? Pogroms were kind of first strikes against the Jews. Jews were accused of using diabolical means to spread the plague to Christians. The church actually tried to protect the Jews. They condemned attacks on Jews as illogical. After all, lots of Jews were also being killed by the Black Death. Here's a picture of death triumphant, and this was a major macabre artistic theme. A little macabre ditty. A sickly season, the merchant said. The town I left was filled with dead, and everywhere these queer red flies crawled upon the corpses' eyes, eating them away. Fair make you sick, the merchant said. They crawled upon the wine and bread. Pale priests with oil and books, bulging eyes and crazy looks, dropping like the flies. I had to laugh, the merchant said. The doctors purged and dosed and bled, and proved through solemn disputation the cause lay in some constellation. Then they began to die. First they sneezed, the merchant said, and then they turned the brightest red, begged for water, then fell back, With bulging eyes and face turned black, they waited for the flies. "I came away," the merchant said. "You can't do business with the dead. So I've come here to ply my trade. You'll find this to be a fine brocade." And then he sneezed. And I don't have to tell you what that means. The mortality rate was 35 to 70%, 25 million dead, as we just said before. So what were the political, economic, and social effects of the Black Death? First, a labor shortage. Serfdom almost completely ended in Western Europe after the Black Death. Serfs could command higher wages for their labor, and they could also buy their way out of serfdom with the money they earned. Although serfdom ironically became the preferred method to secure scarce labor in Eastern Europe. Serfdom actually became much stronger in Eastern Europe for many of the same reasons it became weaker in Western Europe. Next, land surplus. Many of those who owned a lot of land died, so the price of land plummeted, and many more people could now buy their own land. Also, in agriculture, lords who depended on their land to sell food got squeezed. Peasants demanded higher wages, and at the same time, the demand for food collapsed because there was so much death. So many of these landed nobility went bankrupt. Also, there were effects on manufacturing and trade. People who made regular items that everyone used suffered economically. There were fewer people to buy those things. And manufacturers had to pay their workers more. They had to price their products higher than most people could afford if they wanted to make a profit. But the people who made luxury items that were harder to afford prospered. Survivors with new wealth that they inherited wanted to treat themselves before the next plague might come and take them out. So the market for everyday stuff went from large to much less large, and the market for luxury items went from small to much less small. The socioeconomic effect. The poor became a lot less poor. The rich, who depended on their land for income, became a lot less rich. People in power sought ways to turn back the clock on the poor. They tried to reinstate serfdom in many places, and they instituted labor laws which froze wages at pre-plague levels. And this led to numerous violent peasant revolts throughout Europe. Amazingly, social institutions like church and government did not break down like they always do in apocalyptic movies. However, the church and the nobility, the two powerhouses of the Middle Ages, lost prestige and power as a result of the plague. If the plague hit, these institutions could do nothing to protect you. As a result, the kings of Europe began to compete with their nobles and with the church for power. And this was the beginning of feudalism's long, slow decline. Kings created more bureaucracy to rule, raise taxes, and pass laws. Finally, the plague led to an overwhelming pessimism, to religious fanaticism, to suspicion of travelers, and to intolerance of Jews.